Today's story begins with a scene that should have been ordinary: a quiet baseball field, an empty stretch of bleachers, and a woman simply enjoying her time outdoors. But what happened next would ignite a firestorm, expose deep-seated assumptions, and remind an entire community that appearances can be dangerously misleading. Welcome back to Swift Tale, where we break down real stories with real lessons. And if this is your first time visiting the channel, let me ask you, would you like, share, and subscribe to join our growing family of storytellers and truth seekers? Your support helps bring stories like this to light. Now, today's tale is unlike any other. It's about a black woman arrested for loitering at a baseball field, an accusation rooted in nothing more than suspicion and the officer's misplaced confidence. What the cops didn't know, however, is that this woman wasn't just any citizen. They had just handcuffed someone who trains federal agents for a living. Yes, the same tactics they attempted to use on her are the ones she teaches professionals to navigate and neutralize. And that twist is exactly why this story matters so much. In a world where snap judgments can spiral into life-changing consequences, this incident serves as a powerful wake-up call about bias, accountability, and the dangers of assuming guilt based solely on appearance. It's a reminder that authority without awareness can lead to embarrassing and sometimes dangerous mistakes. This story isn't simply about an arrest gone wrong. It's about a flawed system being confronted by someone who knows it inside and out. It's about the clash between unchecked power and quiet expertise. Most importantly, it's about how one woman's calm resilience exposes a truth that cannot be ignored. So buckle in, because what unfolded at that baseball field is far more than a misunderstanding. It's a story about identity, perception, justice, and the stunning moment when the officers realized they had made a massive mistake. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. It was a calm, almost unremarkable afternoon at the neighborhood baseball field, the kind of place where the crack of a bat usually echoes across open grass, where families gather on weekends, and where the community comes to breathe, stretch, and unwind. But on this particular day, the field was nearly empty. The sun sat low above the chain-link fences, casting long shadows across the dugout benches. A soft breeze moved the dust along the baseline, and the rhythmic creak of the aluminum bleachers was the only sound that broke the silence. It was the kind of quiet that felt peaceful, almost therapeutic, especially for someone like her, a woman used to busy schedules, demanding training programs, and constant responsibility. This baseball field wasn't just a public space, it was a rare moment of stillness in her life. Surrounding the field was a small neighborhood that prided itself on being safe and orderly, the kind of place where residents waved to one another and where police patrols were regular and predictable. The officers who patrolled this area were familiar faces, sometimes friendly, sometimes authoritative, but always present. They drove the same slow loops around the park and nearby streets, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. Most days they encountered nothing more than teenagers practicing pitches or dog walkers passing through. But on this day, their attention locked onto something they didn't expect: a solitary black woman sitting quietly at the field, minding her own business. To most people, this would be a harmless sight. But to these officers, conditioned by assumption rather than evidence, her presence felt suspicious enough to warrant an unnecessary inquiry. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that the woman they were watching wasn't merely taking a break or relaxing between errands. She was preparing for an upcoming training session, reviewing her notes, and mentally rehearsing the very strategies that many law enforcement agents across the country relied upon to stay sharp, alert, and responsible in the field. To her, this was just a suitable place to think, a wide open space with clear visibility and room to breathe. To the officers, however, who hadn't once considered asking a simple, respectful question, her quiet presence set off a chain of assumptions that would soon spiral into a full-blown confrontation. Small-town calm, the dusty baseball diamond, and the routine police patrol created the perfect stage for a clash between perception and reality. Everything seemed still on the surface, but beneath it all, a storm was already brewing, one that neither the officers nor the community would forget anytime soon. She wasn't just any woman spending a quiet moment at the baseball field. She was someone whose life had been shaped by discipline, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to public service. Her name carried weight in the world of federal training programs, though you wouldn't know it by looking at her. She moved with the calm confidence of someone who understood human behavior far better than most. Years of experience had sharpened her instincts, given her a sixth sense for tension, and taught her how to diffuse conflicts long before they escalated. She had trained hundreds, if not thousands, of federal agents in everything from tactical judgment to de-escalation, the very skills that separate responsible officers from reckless ones. Yet here she was, dressed casually, sitting alone in a quiet park, appearing to be just another citizen enjoying a peaceful moment. Her journey to that role had been anything but easy. Coming from a background where she had to fight twice as hard to be recognized, she learned early on that excellence was her greatest armor. She excelled academically, navigated countless obstacles, and eventually carved out a respected career in federal law enforcement training. Her colleagues admired her, her students feared disappointing her, and her reputation for fairness was unmatched. She believed deeply in the value of good policing, real policing, rooted in empathy, awareness, restraint, and professionalism, and because she believed in it, she demanded it from everyone she trained. She was the type of instructor who didn't allow shortcuts, excuses, or arrogance. Her philosophy was simple: power without discipline was dangerous, and authority without self-control was a liability to the public. Despite her impressive resume, she never bragged about her position or her accomplishments. She preferred to blend in, to observe quietly, to avoid unnecessary praise. She carried herself with humility because she knew the work mattered more than the recognition. Still, her presence commanded respect when she entered a room, not because she demanded it, but because her experience spoke for itself. Out in public, however, none of that mattered. To strangers, she often appeared unassuming, and on that day, at that baseball field, her quiet pause between responsibilities made her look like just another person passing time. She had no reason to expect anything unusual. She certainly didn't expect that officers would approach her with suspicion instead of courtesy. And she definitely didn't expect that the very people who needed her training the most would be the ones to misjudge her so severely. The officers taken a moment to observe her demeanor, the calm posture, the analytical gaze, the absence of agitation. They might have realized they were not dealing with someone aimless or threatening, but they didn't see the discipline. They didn't see the expertise. They didn't see a highly trained federal specialist. They saw only what they chose to see, and in that single, flawed perception lay the spark of the conflict that would soon explode. The officers who would soon cross her path weren't new to the area. They had been patrolling this neighborhood for years, driving the same slow loops past the park, the school, the old rec center, and the baseball field where she sat. To them, this was just another shift in a long line of predictable days, hours spent watching for minor disturbances, checking empty parking lots, and responding to the occasional noise complaint. Routine had become their comfort, and familiarity had bred something dangerous: complacency. Over time, their patrols became less about protecting the community and more about maintaining a feeling of control, even when there was no threat to address. And with complacency came assumptions, quick judgments about who belonged where and who didn't. They were the type of officers who prided themselves on being sharp and aware, but in truth, their instincts were clouded by habits formed over years of unchecked authority. They believed they knew the area and everyone who lived in it. When they saw someone unfamiliar, especially someone who didn't fit their expectation of who belonged in certain spaces, they often defaulted to suspicion instead of curiosity. And on that particular day, when they noticed the woman sitting quietly near the field, their internal narrative began to build before they ever rolled down their window. From inside the patrol car, they exchanged a look, a silent agreement that something seemed off, though neither could articulate why. Perhaps it was her solitude, perhaps it was the fact that they didn't recognize her, or perhaps beneath layers of training and procedure, there lurked biases they had never confronted. Whatever the reason, they approached the situation with the mindset that they were about to address a problem rather than engage with a person. That mindset, in policing, is often where things go wrong. As they turned into the parking lot, their demeanor shifted into the familiar posture of authority: straightened shoulders, lowered voices, hands resting close to holsters out of habit rather than necessity. Without realizing it, their assumptions had already shaped their approach. In their minds, She was not a citizen enjoying a quiet moment. She was someone who required questioning, someone whose presence demanded justification. They didn't pause to consider that she was doing nothing unusual. They didn't consider that she might simply be thinking, resting, or planning her day. Instead, they began crafting a narrative in which her presence was suspicious, an error rooted in perception, not reality. It never occurred to them that they were about to confront someone with more training, more expertise, and more understanding of protocol than either of them possessed. And certainly, it never crossed their minds that this encounter would soon flip their world upside down. To them, this was another moment of enforcement, a simple stop, a routine check, maybe even a chance to exert authority after hours of boredom. But this time, their routine would collide with a woman whose quiet strength would expose just how misguided their assumptions truly were. The moment the patrol car rolled to a stop near the baseball field, the air shifted. She noticed it immediately, not because she felt threatened, but because years of training had sharpened her awareness to even the smallest changes in her surroundings. The low rumble of the engine, the abrupt end of the officer's conversation, and the telltale pause before a door opened, each detail registered in her mind before the officers even stepped out. She didn't move. She didn't panic. She simply observed the way she had taught countless federal trainees to do in uncertain situations. Keep your breathing steady, keep your hands visible, remain aware but don't react prematurely. The basics, fundamentals she could have recited in her sleep. From the officer's perspective, however, the situation was already framed differently. As they walked toward her, their strides carried an edge of authority they hadn't earned in this moment, their eyes scanning her without true curiosity, only suspicion. Instead of approaching with the simple human courtesy of, "Hey, everything okay today?" they came forward with a tone that suggested she needed to explain herself. One of them spoke first, his voice firm and formal, even though there was no reason for it. He asked what she was doing there, why she was alone, and whether she had business being on the field. The questions came not as dialogue, but as interrogation, delivered with the unspoken expectation that she owed them something. She answered calmly because calm was her default. Her tone was polite, measured, and collected. She explained that she was simply sitting, thinking, enjoying the weather, nothing unusual, nothing illegal, nothing that warranted their scrutiny. But instead of easing their concerns, her confidence seemed to unsettle them. They weren't used to people responding with steady assurance. They were more accustomed to nervousness or deference. And when a person didn't display either of those responses, they labeled it attitude or nonchalance or worse, non-compliant. As the officers exchanged glances, their posture shifted. What should have been a simple conversation began to escalate, not because of anything she said or did, but because her presence defied their assumptions. She wasn't intimidated. She didn't babble nervously. She didn't over-explain or shrink into herself. She merely held her ground with quiet dignity. That dignity, however, was interpreted by the officers as defiance. And that interpretation, rooted in their own misconceptions, pushed them toward a decision they would later regret deeply. They asked for identification, still without offering a clear reason. She hesitated, not because she couldn't comply, but because she understood her rights, and because she knew that handing over her federal credentials would shift the dynamic in ways she preferred to avoid. She wanted the interaction to resolve peacefully. Not explosively, she asked why she was being questioned, a reasonable request, but one they took as a challenge to their authority. The tone of their voices sharpened, their posture stiffened, the air grew tighter, heavier. Inside, she felt a familiar disappointment, not fear, not anger, just disappointment. She had taught officers like these. She had seen this pattern unfold before, authority prioritized over communication, ego placed above de-escalation, assumptions overshadowing facts. She hoped they would realize the harmlessness of the situation and back down. But hope, she knew, was not a strategy. One of the officers reached for his radio, a subtle but undeniable shift. The other stepped slightly closer, positioning himself in the way officers do when they've already made up their minds. She stayed still, her hands visible, her breathing even. She didn't match their tension because she had learned long ago that reacting emotionally to someone else's fear or arrogance only made things worse. Still, she could sense the direction things were heading. The questions were turning sharper. Their patience was thinning. And all because she didn't look the way they expected someone innocent to look. What began as a routine patrol had now become a confrontation built entirely on perception. They saw a threat where there was none. They saw defiance where there was only calm. They saw a loitering suspect where there was simply a woman sitting quietly at a baseball field. And in that moment, the tension that had been building like a slow, steady storm was about to break. What happened next unfolded with a painful inevitability, slow enough for her to process every detail, yet fast enough that the officers never paused to reconsider their approach. It started with a shift in tone, a sharpness in the officers' voices that signaled they had crossed an invisible line in their own minds. They were no longer engaging with a citizen, they were preparing to control a suspect. The difference between those two mindsets is subtle but powerful, and she recognized it the moment it happened. One officer stepped forward, his hand inching toward his duty belt with the kind of performative caution meant to communicate dominance rather than actual concern. He repeated his demand for identification, but this time the command carried the implication that refusal was no longer an option. She inhaled slowly, drawing on years of training she had provided to others about exactly these types of escalating encounters. She knew the protocol, she knew the law. And she knew that despite doing absolutely nothing wrong, she was being pushed toward a confrontation she had tried to avoid. She calmly asked again why she was being detained, reminding the officers that she had every right to sit alone in a public park. Her tone remained even, unprovoked, but instead of hearing her words, the officers heard defiance. To them, a lack of submissiveness equaled resistance. They couldn't understand how someone could stand firm without being aggressive, how someone could question their commands without hostility. Their own discomfort was shaping the narrative in their minds. She wasn't complying, therefore she must be hiding something. One officer stepped closer, too close, invading her personal space in an effort to intimidate. She didn't flinch. Her stillness seemed to unsettle him even more. The second officer, watching this unfold, decided it was time to act. Without offering further explanation, he informed her that she was being detained for loitering. The accusation landed with the weight of absurdity. Loitering, for sitting on a bench in a park, for doing what dozens of people did every day without question. But she knew better than to challenge the accusation in that moment. She had trained too many officers to understand that logic and fairness often evaporate once adrenaline and ego take the wheel. She stood up slowly, deliberately, showing her empty hands. "I am not resisting," she said clearly, making sure her voice carried no trace of threat. She made eye contact, calm and steady, the way she taught trainees to do in high-stress scenarios, to remind themselves and others of their humanity. But the officers didn't meet her gaze. They were too focused on following through with the story they had created in their minds. Her calmness only made them more determined. Before she could say anything else, the first officer grabbed her wrist, not harshly at first, but firmly enough to signal that the situation had shifted into official action. The second officer moved behind her, already pulling out the handcuffs. She let them take her hands, not out of fear, but because she understood that resisting, even verbally, would only escalate their aggression. She felt the cold metal clamp around her wrists with a familiar click. How many times had she demonstrated the proper way to apply cuffs? How many trainees had she corrected for being too rough or too careless? But now, standing in a quiet park, she was the one being restrained, wrongfully, unnecessarily, and entirely because these officers refused to see her as anything other than a problem. As they led her toward the patrol car, the officers recited the standard lines, detached, rote, mechanical. She listened, but her mind was elsewhere. She wasn't thinking about embarrassment or anger. She was thinking about the system she had dedicated her life to improving, the system she believed could be fair when properly trained and held accountable. And yet here she was, a victim of the very flaws she worked to fix. People across the field began to watch. A man pulled out his phone, recording quietly. A couple whispered among themselves, exchanging confused glances. She kept her head high as the officers guided her toward the back seat of the car. She didn't want pity. She didn't want outrage. She simply hoped that whatever happened next would reveal the truth, not for her sake, but for theirs. Because she knew what they didn't. The moment they processed her ID, the moment they ran her information, the moment someone higher up saw her federal credentials, everything would change. The question wasn't if the officers would regret this decision, it was when. And for them, that moment was approaching much faster than they realized. As the officers guided her toward the patrol car, the energy around the baseball field shifted from quiet afternoon calm to unsettled curiosity. The scrape of metal bleachers echoed as a couple nearby stood up, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. They had seen her sitting alone minutes earlier, peaceful and undisturbed, and now she was being led away in handcuffs as though she had done something dangerous. Confusion rippled through the small cluster of people scattered across the field. It wasn't the kind of scene anyone expected to witness during a casual day at the park. A man sitting on the third base bleachers was the first to pull out his phone. At first, he recorded reluctantly, his hand trembling with uncertainty, his voice whispering into the mic, "I don't know what's going on, but this doesn't look right." He wasn't a troublemaker, wasn't someone who typically challenged authority, but something about the arrest felt off. He had seen her sitting there for nearly half an hour, quietly writing in a notebook. She didn't bother anyone. She didn't cause any disturbance. She looked normal. The officers' aggressive posture felt unnecessary, their voices too sharp for such a peaceful environment. Instinct told him to document what he was witnessing, just in case. Across the field, a mother tugged her son closer, whispering that they should head home. Her eyes lingered on the woman in handcuffs, unsure whether the officers were justified or simply overstepping. A pair of teenagers paused mid-jog along the track that circled the park, exchanging uneasy glances as they debated whether to stay or go. Even those farther away, people who couldn't hear the officers or the woman but could sense the tension, found themselves glued to the unfolding scene. Then, almost too quietly for the officers to notice, came the first spark of recognition. A man jogging laps along the outfield paused when he caught sight of her face. His brow furrowed. He knew her not personally but professionally. She had led a seminar he attended during his brief time in federal service. He remembered her distinctly, the poised instructor with razor-sharp insight and a calm authority that commanded the entire room. He slowed his steps, torn between stepping forward and keeping his distance. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also understood the gravity of the mistake being made. "That's not just some woman," he murmured under his breath. "They have no idea who they're dealing with." But when he approached cautiously and attempted to speak to one of the officers, he was dismissed with a hand gesture and a curt, "Sir, step back." His lips tightened. He raised his hands in surrender and stepped away, but his frustration simmered beneath the surface. He wanted to warn them, to tell them that they were about to embarrass themselves, their department, and possibly more, but they weren't interested in listening. Their minds were locked into enforcement mode, and anything challenging that narrative felt like interference. By now more phones were out, more eyes were watching. A small crowd formed, not aggressive, just concerned. People whispered among themselves, questioning what she could possibly have done. Every onlooker could see her calm posture, her composed expression, her respectful demeanor. Nothing about her behavior matched the image of someone being arrested for a legitimate reason. As she was placed in the back of the patrol car, she caught sight of the bystanders, some recording, some whispering, some simply staring in disbelief. Part of her heart sank, not for herself, but for what this scene represented. A familiar pattern, a predictable outcome she had spent years working to prevent. But intertwined with the disappointment was a sense of inevitability. She knew that once her identity surfaced, every witness standing there would realize they had watched a moment of profound injustice unfold. The officers, however, remained oblivious. They shut the car door with a firm click, acting as if they had just completed a necessary duty. They avoided the eyes of the bystanders, pretending not to notice the growing discomfort around them. But even they couldn't fully ignore the weight in the air, the subtle shift from passive curiosity to quiet indignation. It wasn't rage, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. The kind of tension that grows legs, walks into social media feeds, stirs conversation, and ignites accountability. And as the patrol car pulled away, leaving the baseball field buzzing with whispered disbelief, one truth became clear. This incident wouldn't stay quiet. Not for long. The crowd had seen enough to know something wasn't right. And soon the rest of the world would know it too. The patrol car's engine hummed steadily as they pulled away from the baseball field, but inside the vehicle, a heavy quiet settled. She sat in the back seat, hands cuffed, posture calm, eyes fixed on the blur of trees and passing houses beyond the window. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't even angry. Instead, she was reflective, processing the series of unnecessary decisions that had led to this moment. She knew this wasn't a felony arrest or a high-risk situation. She wasn't being taken in for violence or theft. She was being detained for loitering. A vague, flimsy accusation officers leaned on when they had nothing else, and she knew that. Still, the gravity of the situation was not lost on her. What concerned her most wasn't her own inconvenience, but the mindset behind the officers' actions, a mindset she'd spent her career trying to correct. When they arrived at the station, the atmosphere inside was noticeably different from the tension outside. The building buzzed with typical shift change noise, phones ringing, radios crackling, officers walking briskly between desks with coffee cups and clipped conversations. The officers who brought her in, however, marched with an air of exaggerated seriousness, as though they had just apprehended someone dangerous. They barely looked at her as they guided her inside, more focused on presenting their arrest as justified and routine. At the booking desk, the tone began to shift. The sergeant on duty glanced up from his paperwork as the officers approached. He nodded, expecting a simple report, but when his eyes landed on her, his expression changed, just slightly, just enough to betray confusion. She met his gaze with that same composed calmness. Something about her demeanor didn't fit the typical profile of someone being arrested for a petty offense. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't belligerent. She had the stillness of someone who had been in far more serious rooms with far more serious people. "What's the charge?" the sergeant asked, eyes flicking between her and the arresting officers. "Loitering," one officer replied confidently, as though saying it louder might make it more legitimate. The sergeant's brow creased. He looked at her again. "Loitering here." "Yeah," the officer continued. She wouldn't ID herself, seemed suspicious, wouldn't explain why she was at the baseball field. This time the sergeant's face shifted from confusion to mild irritation, not at her, but at the officers. He'd seen situations like this before. He knew when something didn't add up. "Let me see her ID," he said. The officer hesitated. She didn't want to provide it. The sergeant turned to her directly, voice softer, more respectful. "Ma'am, would you be willing to provide identification now?" She nodded once, yes. She had no intention of revealing her credentials during the encounter at the park. She wasn't going to fuel the officers' egos by proving her importance or flashing authority. But now, inside the station, with someone reasonable asking calmly, she had no reason to hold back. The moment the sergeant saw the federal seal on her badge, the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. His eyes widened. He lifted the ID slightly, as though needing to confirm it wasn't some elaborate mistake. Her name, her position, her clearance level. It was all there, undeniable, irrefutable, and directly contradicting the officer's narrative. He looked at her with a mix of surprise and respect. He looked at the officers with something closer to disbelief. You train federal agents?" the sergeant asked, his voice low. She nodded again, still calm. "Yes." The sergeant exhaled a long breath. He turned slowly toward the officers, his expression now hardening into something colder, sharper. "You brought in the person who teaches our federal partners how to handle high-risk encounters for loitering." The officers stiffened. One swallowed hard. The other's face began to pale. The sergeant wasn't done. "And you cuffed her, and you didn't check anything. You didn't verify her story. You just brought her in." The weight of that question hung in the room like a hammer about to drop. Suddenly, the officers weren't standing tall anymore. Their bravado evaporated. They glanced at each other nervously, realizing with growing horror that the routine stop they'd puffed into an arrest had just detonated beneath them. The sergeant turned back to her. "Ma'am, we owe you an apology." She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk. She simply nodded, her calm expression unchanged. She had seen this exact dynamic before, authority unraveling in the face of truth. But the turning point wasn't just the shock of her identity. It was the realization that everything the officers had done, from the initial suspicion to the arrest, was about to face severe scrutiny, internally, possibly publicly, and definitely professionally. The sergeant ordered her to be uncuffed immediately. The officers obeyed with stiff, robotic movements, their hands trembling slightly. For the first time since the encounter began, they looked at her not with suspicion, but with a dawning awareness of how deeply they had misjudged the situation. And this was only the beginning. Because once her identity was logged into the system, once a supervisor reviewed the arrest report, once word spread beyond the room, the dominoes would begin to fall. What happened next wouldn't just change the officer's day. It would shake the entire department. The ripple effect of the arrest began almost immediately. Inside the precinct, whispers filled the hallways, carrying a mix of disbelief, embarrassment, and simmering anger. Officers who had been present for years exchanged wary glances, their pride quietly bruised by the realization that a routine stop had exploded into a spectacle of incompetence. Superiors were summoned, reports were pulled, and cameras from the field began to make their way through internal channels. It was no longer just about a misunderstanding at a baseball field. It was a matter of departmental integrity, training, and public perception. And in the world of law enforcement, perception was as critical as action. The sergeant who had first recognized her credentials initiated an immediate internal review. He called in the arresting officers, one at a time, for a formal discussion. Questions were pointed. Why did you approach her that way? Why did you escalate the situation? Why didn't you confirm the facts before making an arrest? Every answer felt rehearsed, defensive, and insufficient. The officers stumbled over their words, attempting to justify their assumptions, their decisions, their failure to recognize the obvious. They were suddenly confronting the harsh reality that authority, when misused, could collapse under its own weight, and they were the ones standing in the wreckage. Meanwhile, word of the incident spread beyond the precinct. Videos recorded by bystanders had already begun circulating, capturing the calm woman, handcuffed, standing quietly while the officers carried out an unnecessary arrest. On social media, reactions were swift and vocal. People expressed outrage, confusion, disbelief, and support for the woman. Many pointed out the obvious irony. The very person being arrested was the one entrusted with teaching law enforcement professionals how to handle high-pressure situations properly. The story resonated because it struck at the heart of broader societal issues: bias, authority, and the dangerous gap between perception and reality. Public pressure mounted. Community leaders and local advocacy groups called for statements, formal apologies, and an examination of departmental practices. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale of assumption and overreach. The narrative was stark. Officers trained to enforce the law had been outmaneuvered by someone whose calm expertise highlighted their procedural flaws. It wasn't just embarrassing. It was a stark lesson in accountability, humility, and the limits of unchecked authority. Internally, the officers were ordered to submit detailed written reports explaining their actions from the moment they saw her at the field. Every decision, every step, every command had to be justified in writing. For the first time, they were forced to confront not just what they had done, but why they had done it. Their confidence wavered under the weight of scrutiny. The questions weren't just procedural, they were ethical, moral, and professional. How had a situation that should have been a routine encounter escalated into a public relations disaster? How had they misjudged someone whose credentials and training far surpassed their own? Meanwhile, the woman handled herself with the same composed professionalism she had maintained throughout the encounter. She gave statements calmly, cooperated fully with investigators, and refrained from public outbursts, even as the story drew national attention. Her focus remained on the broader lesson. This incident wasn't simply about her, it was about improving systems, correcting biases, and ensuring that law enforcement acted with awareness, fairness, and humility. Her response contrasted sharply with the officer's defensiveness, highlighting the gap between expertise and assumption, preparation and impulsivity, composure and arrogance. The fallout was inevitable. Departmental leadership faced hard questions, not only from internal affairs but from the public. Policies regarding interactions with civilians, the escalation of minor incidents, and the verification of identities was scrutinized. Training programs were evaluated to determine whether officers were equipped to recognize expertise and handle encounters without bias or unnecessary force. And in the midst of it all, one fact remained undeniable. The arrest, however small it might have seemed, had exposed serious flaws that demanded attention, reflection, and reform. By the end of the week, the incident had become more than a story, it had become a lesson. The officers learned that authority was not a shield from accountability. The department learned that assumptions could erode trust faster than any external threat. And the woman, quietly and professionally, became a symbol of the importance of expertise, dignity, and calm under pressure. The ripple effects would continue to resonate, shaping policies, conversations, and awareness for months to come. This incident at the baseball field may have seemed small at first, a routine interaction, a simple patrol, but it revealed something much larger: the power of assumptions, the danger of authority without awareness, and the critical importance of accountability. A woman, quietly sitting and minding her own business, was mistaken for a threat, not because she had done anything wrong, but because her presence didn't fit the narrow expectations of the officers. And yet, through her calm demeanor, professionalism, and expertise, she not only defused a potentially volatile situation, she also exposed the mistakes of those entrusted with public safety. Her composure and knowledge became a mirror for the department, showing what proper training and self-awareness could look like, and what happens when they're absent. There's a broader lesson here that resonates far beyond one arrest or one police department. We live in a world where snap judgments happen all the time, where people are misjudged based on appearance, race, or assumptions about behavior. Situations like this force us to pause and ask ourselves, how do we perceive others? How do we react to authority and to those under it? And perhaps most importantly, how do we ensure that our systems, whether law enforcement, workplaces, or institutions, are fair, accountable, and guided by expertise rather than bias? For the officers involved, the consequences were immediate and humbling. For the woman, the incident became a testament to the importance of patience, knowledge, and restraint in the face of injustice. And for the community, it served as a wake-up call. Authority must be tempered by awareness, and assumptions can have consequences that ripple far beyond the moment. Everyone who witnessed the arrest, online, in person, or through the media, learned a lesson in humility and in the importance of seeing beyond appearances. While the incident at the baseball field might initially appear as a single misunderstanding, it reflects a much larger, systemic issue that affects countless people every day: the way racial bias and assumptions shape interactions with authority. The woman's experience was not just a personal affront, it was a mirror of a social reality in which Black individuals are disproportionately subject to suspicion, scrutiny, and over-policing. Her calm, professional demeanor could not prevent the officers from seeing only what they expected: a Black woman out of place. This kind of automatic judgment is rooted in implicit bias, a subconscious filter that affects decisions and perceptions even when overt prejudice is absent. Studies show that such biases are not isolated incidents, but patterns that affect hiring, policing, education, and countless aspects of daily life. For law enforcement, this means that split-second decisions, like who looks suspicious, can have profound consequences. The baseball field incident is a stark example. An officer's assumption transformed a routine public moment into a public arrest, all because they allowed preconceptions to override observation, context, and reason. This is exactly why training, awareness, and accountability are not optional. They are necessary safeguards against mistakes that can have real-world consequences, including humiliation, legal exposure, and loss of public trust. The broader lesson extends beyond policing. Every organization, institution, and social system faces the same challenge: how to ensure authority is exercised fairly, objectively, and responsibly. When people rely on assumptions instead of facts, when they confuse discomfort with danger or difference with threat, the consequences are not limited to embarrassment. They can perpetuate systemic inequities. Her story illustrates this clearly. Someone with extraordinary training, experience, and respect for the law was misjudged purely because of the assumptions of those enforcing it. That clash between expertise and assumption, professionalism and misperception, reveals a societal fault line that cannot be ignored. What makes this incident remarkable is not just the error itself, but how it highlights the importance of education, de-escalation, and self-awareness. Officers are trained to act decisively, but decisiveness without context, humility, or verification can easily turn justice into error. And for society, it serves as a reminder that awareness is not just a law enforcement issue, it's a human issue. Each of us carries biases, each of us makes assumptions, and each of us must confront the ways those perceptions affect how we judge and respond to others. Her calm handling of the situation also demonstrates another critical point. Expertise can counter ignorance, but only if systems recognize and respect it. If the officers had paused, observed carefully, and approached her with curiosity rather than presumption, the incident could have been avoided entirely. Instead, what unfolded serves as a cautionary tale, a real-world case study in how authority without awareness can go astray, and how even the most competent professionals can be caught off guard by the biases of others. In this way, the baseball field arrest transcends a single encounter. It becomes a teaching moment for law enforcement, institutions, and communities alike, a story that challenges us to examine how we see each other, how we act, and how we can prevent unnecessary harm when assumptions cloud judgment. While the world around her escalated into chaos, her mind remained a calm, strategic center. Sitting on that bench at the baseball field, then later in the patrol car, she wasn't just reacting, she was analyzing. Every movement, every glance, every command from the officers was catalogued and assessed. Years of training in high-pressure environments had taught her to compartmentalize fear, control adrenaline, and remain fully present. In her mind, panic was a luxury she could not afford, because losing control, even momentarily, would have only worsened the situation. Instead, she focused on fundamentals, breathing steadily, keeping her hands visible, maintaining eye contact, and projecting calm authority without challenging theirs directly. This wasn't mere discipline, it was emotional intelligence in action. She understood human behavior deeply, the ways people project power, the subtle cues that indicate uncertainty, aggression, or bias. She recognized that the officer's escalating tone, unnecessary insistence, and assumptions about her behavior were not personal attacks. They were patterns rooted in training, ego, and bias. By separating the personal from the procedural, she maintained control over her own response, even as the situation spiraled beyond reason. Her strategy also reflected a careful balance between compliance and assertion. She wasn't passive, nor was she confrontational. She knew that any overt defiance could be misinterpreted as resistance, yet complete submission could reinforce the officer's flawed narrative. By speaking clearly, standing calmly, and answering questions without over-explaining, she maintained dignity and authority simultaneously. Every word was measured, every gesture intentional. She was exercising the very skills she taught others to master: situational awareness, de-escalation, and tactical patience. Even in the back of the patrol car, when handcuffed, she remained composed. She observed the officers quietly, noting micro-expressions, posture, and tone. She processed the dynamics of power in the vehicle and considered how to mitigate further escalation. She knew that the revelation of her credentials could turn the tables, but she didn't reveal them prematurely. That restraint reflected her understanding of authority. Respect must be earned, not assumed, and timing is critical when navigating high-stakes interactions. Emotionally, she felt a mixture of disappointment and resolve. Disappointment at the officers, failure to recognize her professionalism and humanity, resolve to handle the situation correctly without letting bias dictate her actions. There was no anger that clouded her judgment, no fear that made her hesitant. She understood that the unfolding situation was not just about her, it was a reflection of systemic issues she had spent her career addressing. By maintaining composure, she became both the calm center and the unspoken lesson, demonstrating to those who watched and would later learn about the incident what effective, principled action looks like under scrutiny. Her mindset offers a profound lesson. Even in situations where others misjudge or misinterpret you, self-control, clarity, and patience can shift outcomes. While the officers acted impulsively, she acted deliberately. While they relied on assumption, she relied on awareness. And in the end, it was this combination of expertise, composure, and emotional intelligence that transformed a humiliating encounter into a powerful lesson, one that would resonate far beyond that baseball field. Once the story reached the public, the incident at the baseball field quickly became more than a local curiosity. It became a national talking point. Videos captured by bystanders circulated on social media, showing the calm, composed woman being handcuffed while the officers acted as if enforcing the law was more important than verifying facts. The footage struck a chord with viewers everywhere, generating a mix of outrage, disbelief, and admiration for her restraint. Comments flooded platforms, ranging from expressions of solidarity and respect for her professionalism to sharp critiques of the officer's poor judgment. The story resonated precisely because it revealed a universal truth. Even in institutions designed to uphold justice, human error, bias, and assumptions can have tangible, often damaging consequences. News outlets quickly picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about authority, perception, and accountability. Headlines highlighted the irony. The woman being arrested was, in fact, a federal trainer, someone responsible for teaching the very skills the officers lacked in that moment. Media coverage explored both the personal and societal angles, emphasizing how systemic issues like implicit bias can influence even routine encounters, and how professionalism and calm demeanor can turn potential disasters into teachable moments. Expert commentary further amplified the discussion, analyzing how microaggressions, misjudgments, and unchecked authority manifest in everyday law enforcement interactions. Public reaction wasn't limited to online platforms. Community leaders, advocacy groups, and law enforcement agencies themselves began engaging with the story, using it to spark dialogue about training, accountability, and racial equity. Many praised the woman's handling of the situation, citing her restraint and expertise as a model for how individuals should respond under pressure. At the same time, the officers involved faced scrutiny, both internally and externally, as people questioned departmental protocols, decision-making processes, and mechanisms for oversight. The incident became an example of how a single misstep can ripple outward, affecting public trust and departmental credibility. Social media also highlighted the wider implications of the story. Conversations emerged about the role of race in law enforcement encounters, the dangers of assumptions and profiling, and the importance of recognizing expertise rather than relying on superficial judgments. The woman's calm, professional handling of the incident became a touchstone for discussions on conflict resolution and effective communication in high-stress situations. Each retweet, share, or comment served to amplify the lesson. Authority unchecked by awareness is prone to error, and accountability is necessary at every level. By the end of the first week, the story had transcended its initial location, reaching audiences across the country. It sparked debate, reflection, and policy discussions in ways that the officers never anticipated. What had begun as a seemingly minor incident, a routine stop at a baseball field, had evolved into a national conversation about professionalism, justice, and the human impact of assumptions. It became a story that demanded attention, reflection, and change, demonstrating the power of calm expertise in the face of authority gone astray. By now, the incident at the baseball field has revealed not only what went wrong, but also what can be learned from it. First and foremost is the importance of awareness, both personal and situational. The woman's ability to remain calm, assess the environment, and respond deliberately demonstrates how situational awareness can prevent a minor encounter from spiraling into disaster. It's a skill that goes beyond law enforcement. Anyone navigating public spaces, professional environments, or high-stress situations can benefit from observing details, reading cues, and responding thoughtfully rather than reactively. Another major takeaway is the power of composure and emotional intelligence. In this story, the woman's restraint wasn't passivity, it was strategy. By maintaining calm, speaking clearly, and using body language intentionally, she maintained control over her own narrative even as the officers imposed theirs. For viewers, this is a reminder that responding to confrontation with composure can change the outcome dramatically. It's a practical lesson in conflict resolution. Staying grounded, assessing the situation, and acting with intention can prevent escalation and protect personal integrity. The story also highlights the dangers of assumptions, bias, and overconfidence in authority. The officer's misjudgment demonstrates how reliance on preconceived notions can lead to errors, humiliation, and loss of trust. For viewers, this serves as a reminder to question first impressions, seek verification before making judgments, and recognize the limits of authority, whether in professional settings, social interactions, or institutional contexts. Understanding that bias can influence behavior helps us all act more fairly, consciously, and responsibly. Finally, the story is a powerful lesson in accountability and advocacy. Systems and individuals alike must be held responsible when mistakes occur. The woman's experience underscores the importance of standing by your rights, knowing your value, and exercising professional knowledge with integrity. It's about being prepared, informed, and resilient, skills that anyone can cultivate to navigate unfair or challenging situations. Whether it's public interaction, workplace conflict, or personal safety, the principles of awareness, restraint, and assertiveness apply universally. By reflecting on this story, viewers can take away actionable insights, observe before reacting, stay calm under pressure, question assumptions, and uphold personal integrity even when others fail to do so. These lessons are as relevant in daily life as they are in high-stakes professional environments. The baseball field incident may have been a rare moment, but the principles it illustrates are timeless and universally applicable. As we reach the end of this story, the lessons are clear, and the impact resonates far beyond the baseball field. What began as a simple, seemingly routine encounter escalated into a powerful demonstration of the consequences of assumptions, the importance of awareness, and the necessity of accountability. The woman at the center of this incident showed that knowledge, composure, and emotional intelligence are not just abstract ideals. They are practical tools that can change the course of an event, protect dignity, and teach even seasoned professionals how to respond better. Her actions remind us that professionalism and calm can disarm conflict and shine a light on errors that might otherwise remain hidden. This story also underscores a broader moral. Respect and fairness should never be assumed, they must be actively practiced. Authority figures in particular bear the responsibility of checking assumptions, verifying facts, and exercising power judiciously. For the public, the lesson is equally profound. Awareness, patience, and composure can empower us in the face of misunderstanding or misjudgment. Every moment carries the potential for teaching, learning, and growth if approached thoughtfully. The incident may have embarrassed the officers involved, but it also created an opportunity for reflection, reform, and meaningful discussion about professionalism, bias, and accountability. At Swifttail, we tell stories like this because they matter, not just for entertainment, but for reflection, learning, and sparking conversations that lead to change. We hope this story encourages you to think critically about how assumptions shape actions, how calmness can protect both yourself and others, and how knowledge and preparation can turn even a tense situation into a teachable moment. Every interaction, no matter how small, carries a lesson if we take the time to observe and understand it. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What lessons did you take from this incident? How would you have handled it if you were in her position or in the officer's position? Your engagement not only supports our channel, it helps build a community that values insight, reflection, and storytelling that makes us think. Stories like this remind us that the world is full of lessons waiting to be uncovered. Authority, bias, professionalism, and composure, all these elements intersect in ways that can surprise us, challenge us, and inspire us. By watching, reflecting, and sharing, you become part of a conversation that encourages accountability, understanding, and growth. And that is exactly why stories like these matter. Thank you for watching Swift Tale. Stay aware, stay thoughtful, and remember, calm, knowledge, and integrity are more powerful than assumptions ever will be.